Hey everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a big old slate today. We have a monster 12-game slate on this one. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It helps the channel a lot. Alright, so we do have an interesting slate here. We do have some weather concerns. The biggest weather concerns are the New York Yankees-Baltimore game and the Colorado-New York Mets game. Do keep that in mind. I still think everything plays, but I do think those two games do have some risks of delays. Good news is they're early in the slate, so that will definitely give us more time to make determinations on that as we go. When we look at our core plays, Garrett Crochet is the best pitcher on the slate. However, he is very close to not being a core play simply because there's a lot of decent pitchers on the slate. And then the outfield, we have Corbin Carroll, Jazz Chisholm Jr., and Reese Hines. Now, I'm going to preface and say I would, mix and match 2 or 3 of these guys in your lineups if you're making multiple lineups. Not just use all 3 flat, but we do have a lot of potential here. So this slate is big. It's going to be high scoring. We got a lot of good pitchers. It's going to be a pretty crazy slate in general. So let's go ahead and start by looking at our pitchers today. So Crochet is the top overall play on the slate. He has struggled in the last game against Miami, but outside of that, he's been really solid all season long. And he's got a pretty good matchup against Pittsburgh. He also has the best K rate on the slate, but there's a lot of guys on the slate over 6 strikeout potential. So he's definitely not a must play because of that. It's not only that, but he's the highest scoring pitcher or most expensive pitcher, but he is the safest of all the pitchers. So that's why I did move him in here. Looking at some GPP plays today, Sonny Gray. He's struggled some lately, but he has a good K rate here, and he has a decent matchup against the Cubs. I do think that there's some risk there, but he's definitely pretty favorable with a good K rate. Joe Ryan, though, does have a better strikeout potential here, as he does have a good game opportunity here against the Giants. He has been more inconsistent than Gray or Crochet has been this season, but the K rate is about as good as anybody on the slate, and he's got a decent matchup here. Not the best, but the best matchup really falls to for these Gray, Ryan, and Peralta is really Peralta here with against Washington. He also has a high K rate. He's looks really great from the matchup perspective as well. He's got a lower floor than the other 3, but he does have a really good ceiling too because he has a high potential. So he is in a good spot here, and I think he's a favorable matchup. But you couldn't really go. You can feel pretty good about any of these top 4, but I would definitely think Crochet is the best. But Gray, Ryan, and Peralta are all good contrarian options off of him. A couple, little bit more value options today will be Sean Manaea for the Mets. Now, he does have a favorable matchup against the Rockies. He doesn't have the highest ceiling, but he has a safe floor, and the matchup is really solid for him. This game is in the Mets stadium, so if this game doesn't get too much weather, then he's going to be a very good P2 option on the slate. Another P2 option here would be Hunter Brown. Now, he's in a riskier situation against Texas, but before his last game, he had 7 straight games over 18 fantasy points, and he's been a solid in the K rate for most of those games as well. He isn't quite as consistent as some of them, but he is got a good enough K rate that he's definitely a viable option, and he's going to be a low-owned option today that should have some upside at this price point. So we do have 3 extreme GPP options, that being Garrett Cole here for the Yankees. Then we have Brian Wu for Seattle. Let's see here, who is coming off the injured list, so do keep that in mind. And then also Cole Reagans, who's going to be one of the more popular when it comes to ownership, but he's definitely going to be a little bit risky with the matchup here. So I think those 3 guys all have some utility on the slate, but they definitely carry some high risk, high reward. Andrew Heaney does come in as the boomer best play of the slate, as he's cheap, and he has some potential here, but he is going up against Houston, who can definitely score in bunches. A couple low-owned upside guys today would be Spencer Schwellenbach for the Atlanta Braves, and also Tanner Gordon for Colorado at the bottom against the Mets. He's definitely risky, but he definitely does project okay in that situation. But they're high risk, high reward. So the top ownership overall will be Cole Reagan, Sean Manaea, Garrett Crochet, Sonny Gray, and Freddie Peralta in that order. So let's go ahead and look at our catchers today. So catching is actually pretty interesting. It's not a very deep position today, which some days it can be, even with a smaller slate. But this slate, the top overall play really does jump off the page here, and that's Danny Jansen for Toronto. I was very close to making him a core play. He really has struggled lately, though, so that's part of the why I didn't, but he did hit a home run in his last game, and he's going to have a lot of potential in this game. He has been inconsistent throughout the season, but he does have good fantasy metrics today, so I think he's in a viable spot. And he's been, he's hitting the ball better recently, when it comes to home runs. So I do think he's got that upside today. He's probably the cheapest play that I like quite a bit here. Now, if we look at some other options, Salvador Perez, he can play first base as well for Kansas City. He also has a whole lot of home run upside today, but he's had 2 home runs in 2 straight games, and so hopefully he can. He's hit a home run in 2 straight games, and he's been seeing the ball pretty well lately, so he's definitely in play, though he's fairly expensive here. And then William Contreras from Milwaukee also looks interesting today. He has been a little bit less appealing recently because of his price point, but he's still a viable option on the slate if you can afford to pay up here. The top ownership at this position: Mitch Garver, Danny Jansen, Salvador Perez, Tyler Stevenson, and Francisco Alvarez. The low-owned upside guys: Wilson Contreras, Ryan Jeffers, and Jose Trevino here. So it's a very interesting slate, but I do think pit for catchers, but I do think that Jansen is the top overall play. Looking at first base here, this position is pretty good today. It's not super deep, and it's not super cheap either. We're going to start with Vlad Jr. I think Toronto looks really solid on the slate. Even though they don't project particularly great, some of their players do have a lot of potential today for home runs, and Vlad Jr. is one of them. He's also been hitting the ball better lately, finally starting to get himself going this season, so he looks really solid on the slate. Pasquantino for Kansas City, also very interesting today. He does draw that home run metric today, which we do like. His price has come back down a little bit from where it had risen up, but he definitely looks solid on the slate, and so he's definitely worth a look. Christian Walker for Arizona is kind of a sneaky play today, I feel like. For Arizona, he's kind of been inconsistent recently, but the last few games, but he's still getting fantasy points. It's just he's not having big games. But then if you look back at last week, he had a bunch of really big games with home runs and stuff, and I think he's got that potential today as well. Matt Olson is a good contrarian for Atlanta, even though that Atlanta struggled yesterday, didn't do anything. He has been better lately, so he's definitely worth a look from that perspective. The top ownership here: Vlad Jr., Jake Burger, J.D. Davis, Josh Bell, and Salvador Perez. Now, Jake Burger can fit at first base. I'll talk about him more at third base. There's just a bunch of other guys that look pretty solid at this position to not really want to utilize him at this position. Looking at the low-owned upside guys: Jamier Candelario, Spencer Horwitz, Matt Olson, and Vinny Pasquantino. Looking at second base, Marcus Semien does jump off the page as the top overplay for Texas. Now, Texas doesn't project well as a team, but they do have a couple guys that are hitting the ball well, and he's one of them. The other would be Corey Seager, but he has been hitting the ball decently well lately and scoring good fantasy points, and his price is a little bit higher than I'd like it to be, but he's definitely worth a look today. Dennis Schneider, sorry, I can't talk. Davis Snyder. He has been a little bit inconsistent recently, but he's had a couple games with some hits in the last few, and so he does project pretty well for this game. He does have that home run upside, and he's relatively cheap, so he's definitely an interesting play today. He's a little bit contrarian, though, because he's not as good as some of the other options. Jose Altuve, meanwhile, does have good home run metrics today. His hitting has been solid, though he does need to score more fantasy points than he's been scoring lately to pay off here. Gleyber Torres, especially on a big slate like this, Gleyber Torres also looks very interesting for the Yankees today. He might be my favorite play at this position simply because he's been hitting the ball pretty well. But he does, and he's nice and cheap, so he can help you pay up at other positions. Jonathan India for the Cincinnati Reds also looks solid today for Cincinnati. He's been hitting the ball pretty well lately, though he's had some inconsistent games. He does have that kind of boomer bust feel today, but he's priced pretty fair. Nolan Gorman is kind of a contrarian play, too. I do think that he has good enough metrics today to be a viable play today. And you're going to have to take some risks on this slate because you're going to have to, take some cheaper players in order to get this roster construction to work very well. The top ownership at this position: Gleyber Torres, Dylan Moore, Jonathan India, Jose Altuve, and Adam Frazier. The low-owned upside guys: Horwitz, Albies, Oswaldo Cabrera, David Schneider, Jamil Jones from the Yankees if he draws a start, and Marcus Semien. So that position relatively deep today, but there's a lot of different ways you can go. Third base is probably the weakest position on this entire slate, and that does put us in a very interesting position with Jake Burger really jumping off the page as the best overall play at this position. See, what is happening? Uh, Sorry about that, guys. So anyhow, he does look the best at this position. Now, again, if you compare him to all the first basemen, he really doesn't hold up there. But you're gonna have to use somebody here, and I definitely think it's wise to go cheap at this position, just because there's not a lot of good value to begin with. So it's not really worth paying up too much here. But you can find some good cheap options, and Berger's one of them. I think Miami, they don't look particularly great much of the time, but they have a really good situation here, and a couple players from their team look solid today. So I think he's in a good spot, and he's going to have some home run potential on the slate. Looking at Jameer Candelario for Cincinnati, he can also fit in here, though he's a little bit more expensive than I probably want to play today, and he has really been struggling when it comes to strikeouts lately, so he's a little bit of contrarian play. Who you might end up going with is Marte for Cincinnati at third as well. Even though he struggled this season some, he's only played a handful of games. So he does have that big upside, though, as he's had some really solid games, and he's been managed in a couple multi-hit games as well. He's just been kind of inconsistent there, but he does draw good metrics today, so he's definitely worth a look. If we look at the ownership here, Justin Turner, Jake Berger, and J.D. Davis. Low-owned guys, Candelario, Austin Riley, Oswaldo Cabrera, Brooks Lee, Nolan Arenado, Len Sosa, and Jose Miranda. So there's a lot of different ways you can kind of go here, but I definitely think going cheap is the best way, as I think Cincinnati's got a couple guys that you can consider here. So then we'll look at, let's see here, we'll look into the shortstops. Bobby Witt Jr. does come off the page as a great option, but this position is so deep today with Ila De La Cruz, Bobby Witt Jr., Corey Seager, looking all Francisco Lindor and Carlos Correa all being over $5,000 and all look really solid. But if you want to go a little bit cheaper here, and that's probably the good way to go here as well, you're going to have to because it's going to be hard to pay up for a lot of guys. Jeremy Pena is a guy that looks really solid today with good home run potential. Anthony Volpe has got good metrics today, even though he's really struggled lately, so he's definitely in play, though. And then Willy Adames is probably actually one of my sneaky plays for the slate, as Milwaukee really doesn't seem to look all that great as a team, but Willie does look really solid as a player for this particular matchup. For ownership's perspective, Volpe, Lindor, J.P. Crawford, Jeremy Pena, and Bobby Witt Jr., and then low-owned upside, Corey Seager, De La Cruz, and Correa. Looking at outfielders, this position is very not that deep, actually, for the slate, which is surprising. They do have a lot of good overall options, but I do think that the top is a pretty heavy here with Jazz Chisholm Jr., Corbin Carroll, and Reese Hines. I think these three guys are just absolutely favorable. You could get a little bit more expensive with Luis Robert here. For the White Sox, so that is a contrarian way to go. Aaron Judge also does jump off the page here, despite the fact that he's kind of struggled a little bit lately. But then we'll have Julio Rodriguez, who we liked some yesterday. Now, he didn't, he scored 13 fantasy points. So, obviously, at his price point, that's about what we need at minimum. I think he can do that again today, but he's a little bit riskier today. Varsho, if he plays today, he'd be somebody to be of interest. Jake Fraley does kind of have a good sneaky play upside today as a cheap option. Adalis Garcia has improved lately, and I think he does draw some good potential for Texas, even though they don't look particularly great as a team. And then Christian Yelich, he has really improved lately and is hitting the ball well. But Reese Hines, like I mentioned, Jock Peterson, Davis Schneider, Willie Benson, George Springer, Tommy Pham, Lars Nootbaar, Brian De La Cruz, and then MJ Melendez are all kind of contrarian plays on the slate. The top ownership at this position, Corbin Carroll, George Springer, Dylan Moore, Brandon Nemo, Sanchez, Jazz Chisholm, Adam Frazier, Brian De La Cruz, and Juan Soto. The low-owned upside guys, Hunter Renfroe, Aaron Judge, Julio Rodriguez, Mitch Haniger, Dalton Varsho, Byron Buxton, and then the low-owned upside contrarian plays, David Schneider, Jamil Jones, Adolis Garcia, and Luis Robert. So